Okay, chapter 16, A Christmas Wedding. I know you'll be very sad again because there are no vocab and there's only two questions. And you're listening or reading for who was the visitor and where was he from. So it's a dude. So I want that in a nice complete sentence. Only one question, one sentence is needed. Like, who was the visitor? The visitor was blah, 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 and he was from blah, blah. And then who ended up getting married? Complete sentence. Okay? One sentence. So really, two big fat sentences on this one. So relax and enjoy, or read it to yourself, whichever you prefer. A Christmas Wedding, chapter 16. In the house, the countdown to Christmas was ticking like a time bomb. Mother had found her pitch pipe, but her sheet music was out of order. They'd pinned up Ruth Ann's robe. Phyllis was at a mirror, biting her lip to make them pinker. Dad and I hadn't been missed. A knock came at the front door. Ruth Ann began to turn it, and Dad's hand came to hold her back. Mother never looked up from her sheet music. She made sure Phyllis had to answer the door. The boy was standing out there with something in his hand. It looked like a cellophane-covered brick tied up in Christmas tinsel. He took one look at Phyllis, and his eyes bugged slightly. Evidently, she didn't look too much like Casper the Ghost. She may have seemed like an angel, all in white, if you didn't know her. Hello, I'm Brad Dowdle. Ding, ding, ding. I'm Mrs. Dowdle's great-grandson, Joey's son. His voice had already changed. Here for the holidays. So Joey had a son, Brad. Phyllis made a small squeaking sound. It took her a while, but she got out of his way so he could come in. Ruth Ann's eyes were like saucers. He was one good-looking dude of a boy, blonde-headed, and he was wearing a bomber jacket with some fine Levi's and white buck shoes. No sideburns yet, but come to find out, he was just 14, Phyllis's age. Her real age. A very polite guy for a Chicago guy. We all introduced ourselves, and he handed Mother the present, which was a fruitcake. There's more where that came from, he said. Great-grandma thought I might go up to the Christmas concert with you folks. I expect she'll be along later, Mother said. But I wondered, since Mrs. Dowdle wasn't a church woman. Still, I was beginning to figure out that adults move in mysterious ways. Phyllis will be up in the choir loft, Mother told Brad, and of course Ruth Ann. But you can help Bob usher. So, as Dad predicted, we did have a visitor from afar, Chicago. He was even bearing a gift, if you count fruitcake. Brad Dowdle and I had our hands full, finding everybody a place to sit. Finally, people were standing in the back. It wasn't quite the overflow crowd that we had for the princess's funeral, but it was getting there. As Mother said, we were making a joyful noise for a larger community. There were people there who you wouldn't expect. Not Miss Cora Schellebarger, but then she hadn't been spotted off her porch, well, only twice since before the Korean police action. But I myself showed Miss Flora to her pew. Everybody noticed everybody else. As the pews filled, a murmur swept the congregation. People craned to look back to a disturbance at the door. Barging in were 4 or maybe 5 of the roughest characters I've ever seen. Not a haircut among them, and only about 6 teeth. They were bundled up against the winter night in a raggedy combination of caked army surplus and dirty denim. All wore farmer caps, and all were chewing something. As the saying went around here, hogs wouldn't have stayed on their place. 1 or 2 of them may have been women. A whispered name fanned like a breeze across the pews. Burdicks. Just in case Brad and I thought we were going to show them to a pew, one of them put out a big banged up hand, meaning back off. And in they ganged, sticking close. They were carrying something, a bundle in their midst. People in the back pew scooted over to make room for them, way over. There in the pew, the bundle they'd brought stirred and sat up. 1 minute it was a pile of rags with an old floppy hat on top, and the next minute it was Aunt Madge. Aunt Madge Burdick. She glared around at the crowd, who were all staring back. There must have been plenty of people here who hadn't seen her in this century. Are they going to give me any supper? She demanded in a high, cracked voice. Where's my teeth? We heard singing from outside then, not a moment too soon. I switched off the lights. Voices rose from out on the sidewalk. O come all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. The choir proceeded inside, 2 by 2, carrying candles. It was a choir twice Sunday size. O come let us adore him, O come let us adore him, they sang, all the way up to the choir loft. The VFW had donated all their unsold trees, so the choir gathered in front of a somewhat scrubby pine forest. Last in the procession came Dad in his robe, and holding his hand, Ruth Ann, who looked like the littlest angel, at least for this evening. Dad ascended the pulpit, though he did very little preaching from up there. Ruth Ann hiked up her robe and took giant steps up to the choir loft between Mother and Phyllis. Dad spoke out, "Let us go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened." An old cracked voice called out from the back pew, "Luke 2:15. It was Aunt Madge Burdick. "Ring out wild bells," the choir sang. And you'll see it's in quotes, you guys, because it's a song title. "Ring out wild bells," the choir sang under Mother's direction. And then, "Oh, holy night." Phyllis kept losing her place from glancing up for a glimpse of Brad Dowdle out there in the dark. Dad followed up by reading the Christmas story, the one that begins, "Now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night." "Luke," Aunt Madge crackled out from the back. "Every bit of it." The choir sang all the carols in the hymnal, and then it was time for Ruth Ann. Mother gave her a little boost forward, and Ruth Ann raised her candle. "Sing out, honey," Mother was heard to murmur, and Ruth Ann began. "Away in a manger, no crib for a bed, the little Lord Jesus laid down his sweet head." Everybody in the flickering room listened with both ears as Ruth Ann worked through the stanzas, too. "Bless all the dear children in thy tender care, and fit us for heaven to live with thee there." She had it down pat. Then it was nearly over, or so we thought. Dad stood to give us a benediction. "While shepherds watch their flocks by night, we're gathered here by candlelight. Snug we are and manger worn against the winds of winter's storm. Gathered behind these windows stout that keep December's fury out. Gather we here from near and far to wait with the world for a glimpse of the star." Aunt Madge's old crooked finger came up in the dark, but she drew it back. This may not have been scripture. It may have come straight from Dad. The choir rustled their robes, getting ready to proceed out. They shuffled their sheet music as with gladness men of old. Then everything changed. Brad and I were at the back, flanking the door with when it banged open. Wind blew in, candles blew out, people jumped. Brad and I fell back. An enormous figure filled the door. Big. "Hit the lights," it said. So I did. The church flooded with electric light, and it was Mrs. Dowdle there in the doorway. Her hunting jacket was over her arm, but she was dressed as I'd never seen her. It must have been her good dress, maroon with a lot of tucks or whatever across her massive front. Big black shiny shoes, too. The bun on the back of her head rode high with combs. She was, well, all dolled up. The choir hung in the loft. Mother had put up a hand to hold them there. Why did I have this sudden suspicion that she and Mrs. Dowdle were working as a team again? I had a vague vision of Mother with that Winchester broken open over her arm, but the front pew people were on their feet looking back. Mrs. Dowdle's name swept the room. "Hold it right there, preacher," she hollered out to Dad. "We've got us another item of business in the presence of all these witnesses." People gawked at each other. Who did she think she was, busting up the choir concert? She wasn't even a churchwoman. And what business? But Dad didn't look too surprised. In fact, he looked glad to see her, delighted even. He beamed. "And what is that business, Mrs. Dowdle?" he called back to her. "A wedding," she said. The room buzzed like a hive. "A Christmas wedding." "Marriage is a sacrament, Mrs. Dowdle, as you know," Dad remarked. "But it's also a legal contract, and we'll need to see—" "The marriage license?" she boomed. "I got it right here." She reached down in front of her dress and drew out the marriage license. She could have kept the entire Bill of Rights down there. "The bride's not of age," she called out, "but her mother's signed off on her. She don't have much choice." "Without further explanation, Mrs. Dowdle," Dad said, "let us have the happy couple come forth." Mrs. Dowdle lumbered aside and waved them in. A couple stepped up. I was as close to them as I am to you, and it was the surprise of my young life. At first, I thought it was Elvis Presley come among us. I wasn't the only one. The room gasped. But it wasn't Elvis. It was Roscoe Burdick, with a GI haircut and a close shave, in the dress uniform of the U.S. Army private, the full pinks and greens and spit-shine shoes, necktie and all. A necktie on a Burdick was a sight to behold, though Roscoe was swallowing hard. It was Roscoe home on a special leave from basic training at Fort Leonard Wood. Beside him, her hair ablaze in the night, was Waynetta Blaylock, in the same outfit that she'd worn on the homecoming queen's parade float. It didn't fit her as well now. Her dress-up suit strained around her middle. But she had a good firm grip on Roscoe. She'd always said she could make something out of him, Burdick or not. As the Sunday Piatt County Call newspaper reported, the bride was attended by her bridesmaids, schoolmates, all Miss Barbara Jean Jeter, Miss Edna Earl Stubbs, Miss Vaynette Pankey, Miss Bonnie Burhoops, and all of the village, and each carrying a nosegay of flowers in seasonal colors. Waynetta was the first high school senior to be married, except for those who'd run off, so that was some satisfaction to her. It was a satisfaction to Mother, too. I happened to notice up there in the choir loft, and I think I read her lips. They seemed to say this was by far Mother's best Christmas present. Roscoe Burdick, not only in the army, but tied tight in the bonds of matrimony. The first Burdick ever married, in fact. It was the best present Phyllis ever got, too, whether she knew it or not. I couldn't tell from back here, but she seemed to be above it all up there, lofty in the choir loft. If she was having any thoughts at all, they were bound to be of Brad Dowdle. But what Brad made of all this sudden wedding, I didn't know. But hey, he was a Chicago guy, so he'd probably seen everything. Besides, he was staying with Mrs. Dowdle, where the whole business must have been cooked up. Dad pointed to Roscoe and summoned him down to the front. Every eye followed. Roscoe, Private Burdick, turned and gazed back over us. His posture was improved, but there was a panic in his blue and green stare. Blind panic. Dad nodded to Waynetta. We had no piano, let alone an organ, and the wedding march isn't a choral number. Mother had the choir go straight into Joy to the World. Though afterward, long afterward, I overheard her tell Dad that Lo, how a rose ere blooming might have been more appropriate, or even for unto us a child is born. Waynetta teetered down the aisle in her high heels, trailed by her I ought to know better sorority sisters. Mrs. Dowdle herself came next, and behind her, for some reason, Mrs. Wilcox was in her Mackinaw and veiled hat and carpet slippers. What her part in the whole plot was, nobody knew, except she was always all over Mrs. Dowdle like a rubber girdle in a heat wave. You'd have to chloroform her and tie her down to leave her behind. Several members of the Dar made room for them in the front pew as Dad began. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here. When he came to who gives this woman to this man in holy matrimony, Mrs. Dowdle waved a big hand and called out, that be me, as her ma's at home with the sick headache. By now, the whole congregation was having a whale of a good time. People said later that it was the best Christmas choir concert ever held in Piatt County. A terrible old cawing voice called from the back, and I give the groom. It was his grandma, Aunt Madge. So do I, called out Miss Flora Shellabarger, waving from the third pew. By now, the whole church was practically rolling in the aisles. Waynetta and Roscoe were united in matrimony, on wave upon wave of laughter. But as Dad said afterward, that's not the worst beginning for a young couple embarking upon the choppy seas of the uncertain future. So good. All right, have fun with your big fat 2 questions. Bye.